We're going to look a little bit closer today at the Renaissance and kind of the art of the Renaissance, and then we'll take a look at what life was like for people, various people and groups during the Renaissance. So we'll take a look into there. So in the early Renaissance, which kind of the early to mid 1400s, we see the beginnings of these concepts known as geometric perspective, which is adding depth to paintings. We also see the kind of new ideas of organizing paintings in a coherent manner rather than just kind of jumbling everything together, as they would have in the Middle Ages. There's also concern about how the human body moves and trying to capture that movement in your painting and also being anatomically correct. Wanting to really get a sense of what the body looked like and paint that realistically. So some of the early painters who are tackling that are Masaccio, who paints a very interesting image of the crucifixion. Paolo Uccello, he paints the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian, which is kind of one of the early ones to use perspective in organization. We'll take a look at these. Sandro Botticelli paints La Primavera, which pulls in some of those humanist themes. Donatello sculpts the David out of bronze. And then Filippo Brunelleschi, he's an architect. So that may be worth noting, is that he's an architect of this Renaissance era. And he designs a few cathedrals and churches and uses the concepts of math and geometry in order to get geometric ratios and proportions in order to get a better looking building from what had existed kind of beforehand. So the first one is this painting, the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian, and you can see that there is a sense of perspective and depth, but it's not perfect. All of these men up front are kind of the same height and shape, but it's not really exactly what we're looking for. So it's the beginnings. It's the beginnings. And then in terms of movement, you see these men are bending over to reload their crossbows, and not kind of capturing the human movement. These men are pulling back their bowstrings, and so it's pulling those ideas together. La Primavera, again, Botticelli's painting deals with organizing people and adding some level of perspective, but again, not perfect. Geometric perspective is a concept that was designed and worked at over time, but certainly is not something that happened right away. The statue of David, again, works to get the human anatomy correct. Maybe not quite there, but certainly more lifelike and better than previous attempts had been in previous statues. So it's this movement in a direction towards realism and movement and understanding the features. And this culminates in what's called the artistic high Renaissance, where we have people like Da Vinci, Raphael, and Michelangelo in the late 1400s to the early 1500s. And it's just important to remember these dates because we get so caught up in dates that we forget that as these men are doing their paintings, Martin Luther is starting his Reformation, King Henry VIII is killing his wives, Christopher Columbus has sailed across the sea. All of these things are happening, and in some way this information is getting to these men. And it's not necessarily influencing them, but the world is kind of becoming more connected and kind of there's a lot going on besides just painting in Italy. So Da Vinci's Raphael's School of Athens really uses perspective, getting with the depth here all the way to the back and having forms get larger as they come out. And then he organizes it in his own way, kind of putting the most important people he believes in the center and surrounding them on the outside with those who are of lesser importance but nonetheless important to his painting. And these are great figures from Greek and Roman past, so this embodies that humanism of looking to the Greeks and Romans for respect, for ideas, for inspiration. And so he paints all these great Greek and Roman thinkers in a really kind of a Greek and Roman setting, and then also includes some Renaissance painters in there as if to say that we belong as well, we are involved too. The Last Supper really uses the concept of perspective and gives this painting depth. The vanishing point is over here, and as you move out, you see kind of different organizations. You see people moving in ways that they hadn't existed before. I mean, you have these guys with their hands out, and it's like they're pointing to him. This man's putting his hands up as if to kind of shrug it off or push someone back. You really see these concepts of anatomically correct and movement that wouldn't have existed before, because you didn't have depth, you didn't have perspective, you didn't have this organization. You just had two-dimensional flat paintings. But in the Renaissance, that changes, and you get this three-dimensional depth, this real kind of focus on making people come alive and making it very real in order for it to inspire. And the Sistine Chapel, perhaps one of the most famous, painted by Michelangelo. All of the paintings along the top up here depicting various biblical scenes, all of which are very carefully attuned to the human body and anatomy, as well as to focusing on the greatness that humans can achieve. So that's kind of the art in the Renaissance. And so the status of the artist really changes over the course of the Renaissance. So at the beginning, artists are just kind of seen as craftsmen, just like any other, like blacksmith or goldsmith or silversmith, anything like that. That's what the artist is. They're on the same social level and not really kind of distinguished any more than them. But as the Renaissance goes on, artists are kind of held up to a higher standard and almost revered as heroes. And that's because of the people they're working for. So they take these commissions to work for fabulously wealthy princes, noblemen, and merchants. And by being associated with them, they're starting to get kind of higher prestige anyways. But then when these noblemen are kind of in awe of them and fawning over themselves in order to praise them and get more work and get more art from them and get more statues in order to continue to glorify themselves, it really raises the status of the artist so that they become almost deified, almost godlike. And so if you go to Italy, you'll see statues of many of these artists in places of honor because they so represented the Renaissance ideals, but also the power and the greatness that humans could achieve in the Renaissance. In the north, there's another northern artistic renaissance. Two of the more famous people up there are Jan van Eyck and Albrecht Dürer. Van Eyck kind of pushes forward this idea of portraits. It's a Renaissance style. It's very popular in the north with the northern merchant wealth to have self-portraits taken and painted and then hung in the houses. And then Albrecht Dürer kind of follows along the Christian humanist line, which we'll talk about next time, but following kind of more closely with the Christian aspects of humanism, emphasizing early Christian writers in order to find inspiration. So here's Van Eyck painting Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife. Again, it's a portrait, and it's just a really interesting piece. There's a lot going on in terms of color. It tends to be the Northern Renaissance tends to be a lot darker in terms of color usage than the Italian Renaissance for whatever reason. And then if you look closely, you've got this mirror that I think Van Eyck paints himself in as well. So you can kind of get a sense of what this life was like for these two. It's very also helpful for historians to get an understanding of fashion at the time and what people were wearing, because these people would have stood for this painting for at least a time. So this is the sort of thing we can see kind of what's in their house, how it was decorated, and what they're wearing. So the self-portraits are nice pieces of art, but they're also historically important for us historians. And then Adoration of the Magi. The Magi were the three wise men from the biblical story who came to, when Jesus was born, to deliver gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And so Dürer paints this. Again, the concept of perspective has spread to the north, so you can see that as things get further away, they tend to get smaller. Things in the foreground are a bit larger. And again, you see kind of the darkness. I mean, it's a bright painting, but you have very dark fabrics being used. And that's just a testament to kind of each culture wearing different things and people imposing their culture on others. Another art form that kind of grew during the Renaissance was music, and music was often centered in the area of Burgundy. It just was. an area that was a musical hotspot at this time. And Guillaume Dufay is one of the more famous composers. And Renaissance music was notable for having kind of multiple melodies occurring at the same time, which was a new break from the past and from earlier music. And this occurs, again, for the same reason that the rest of the Renaissance occurs. There's finally money. So when people have money, they're able to, when there's money floating around in a society, there are people who are able to sponsor artists, or who are able to pay to go to concerts, or who will pay for private lessons for music. And so all of this leads to kind of this growth of the music industry. And it really takes off in the Renaissance. And one of the other forms that becomes popular is something known as the Renaissance Madrigal. And the Madrigal is a group of anywhere from 3 to 8 people who sing, and there's generally no musical accompaniment. It's just their voices making the music. And the Renaissance madrigals often would sing old poetry or even new poetry in order to kind of really emphasize the poems and individual stanzas and even individual words. Just that overemphasis on the importance of what had been written. So music in the Renaissance really shifts. It becomes much more complex than it was before. Now we're going to look very briefly at society in the Renaissance and what it looks like here. So the Renaissance sees a real growth in education, and that's one of its biggest legacies, is that education kind of takes off. There's the development of a new field of study also called history, which I believe is important for obvious reasons. And then the invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg really fundamentally changes society and the world as a whole. So education during the Renaissance emphasized a few things, and that's what they call the liberal studies, or what we would call now humanities often. But it does also include math, astronomy, and music. And if you remember, the idea of the Renaissance man, the perfect man in the Renaissance, was to become an expert at all of these things. They should know history, they should know philosophy, they should be able to speak and write and read poetry and do math and make music and wrestle and fight and ride horses. They were expected to be perfect in everything. And so there is this focus on education as being very, very important to this passing on of knowledge and to becoming a true idealized Renaissance man. Oftentimes women were educated as well, especially those women who were from wealthy families. They had access to the same level of education as the men, and a lot of Renaissance writers and Renaissance thinkers believe that was genuinely important because they hoped to create these complete citizens, and they wanted not just the men to be complete citizens, but the women to be as well, because there was a sense that if the women were educated, that would have a trickle-down effect on the women's children. So it's not like, oh, women will get very educated and then go make a real positive effect on society, but they would have a positive effect on their children, both daughters and sons, and then their sons and daughters would come out more educated, kind of spinning off this cycle of education within society growing over time. History becomes a focus. It ties in with the concept of secularization, which is the focus on the here and now rather than the afterlife. And so let's try and understand our world and the here and now. And so Guicciardini takes off on this real tough task of writing two histories, a history of Italy and a history of Florence. And we saw it a little bit in Greece and Rome, but it disappears during the Dark Ages of Europe. But we see real historical accuracy being cared for, of interviews and use of primary sources and real attempts to tell the history, not tell the myth, which is a truly important change that exists in history and leads to the modern concept of history. Johannes Gutenberg invents the printing press sometime around 1450. The dates are always shifting, and that's in part due to bad calendar use and bad calendar existence, but it's sometime around 1450. Generally 1453, I think, is an accepted date. Movable type was introduced to him from China. He kind of modified that, improved upon it, and then created this printing press in 1453. From 1455 to 1456, he prints what's known as the Gutenberg Bible, which is his copy of the Bible. He makes about 200 copies of those. Each one he tries to make as intricate and ornate as a handcrafted one so that he could sell them, because remember, handwritten books were super expensive. So if he made his quality as good as those handwritten books, he could sell them for a lot of money and thus profit greatly. Eventually his business overheads cost too much and Gutenberg ends up going broke, so we recall him as being kind of the father of the printing press, really transforming society, but he himself found himself in terrible bankruptcy and kind of spent the last years of his life just kind of in misery because he lost everything. But the printing press has such tremendous impact. And so we're going to kind of look at this flowchart here. So we see that Europe had kind of been in the Dark Ages, but they were slowly making their way out of it, and there was increased trade with China across what is known as the Silk Road. And from that we get the woodblock printing and then paper. And that goes across the Silk Road into the Ottoman Empire, and then the Ottoman Empire trades it over. Or, I mean, it's not really traded, but the idea, the concept, merchants would have seen these books, would have understand these block printing and be like, oh, what is that? How does that work? And so slowly that information and that knowledge is spread into Europe, okay? But meanwhile, in Europe, we have a few things happening. So when the Black Death hits Europe, very few people, well, a whole lot of people die, and very few people survive it. And so some of the people who are hit hardest are the priests and monks, and those were the same people who were literate. Those were basically the only people who could read and write. And so when they die off, they're able to produce less copies of books. That means that books are even more expensive than before. Now, this is a problem because books are more expensive, but people who survived had a higher standard of living, they had a lot more money, and they wanted to buy things. But books were more expensive because they didn't exist. There were less of them. So it's not like, oh, we have the money, we'll buy this luxury item, but the scarcity of goods made it harder to buy. So there's this desire to kind of find a cheaper way to produce books. You also have an increase, with more universities being built, an increase in an educated class. So you have more people who can read, more people who want books, and less people producing books. So this kind of all culminates in, I don't know that it's a major social problem. That's kind of maybe painting too grave of a picture. But it's like a problem. People want these books and they don't exist. So Johannes Gutenberg eventually puts it all together and invents the printing press. And this changes everything, because now information can be spread quickly and accurately. Instead of taking, months to write a Bible, he can print it in a couple of days. And so the production time decreases drastically, the labor expense decreases drastically, and he's able to spread this information. And soon it's figured out that, hey, it's not just Bibles and books that can be printed, but pamphlets. And suddenly information spreads really quickly. And this is important because before, when there were heretical ideas, all you had to do was kind of kill the guy who had the heretical ideas, and it would die out because he generally wasn't able to write it down. If he was lucky, he had someone who was smart enough to write it down, but they couldn't write down a lot because of the cost of paper, the time consuming of doing it. But now, if you have someone with a heretical idea or a different idea, say Martin Luther, he's able to print a ton of copies and thus spread his ideas much more quickly. This creates the Protestant Reformation, which we'll get to in a minute. The accuracy of this data is really important for research, because now people in different countries are able to share research with each other and share information with each other across the continent, and it's accurate. And so everyone's working on the same page, everyone's working off the same knowledge set, and so we see this massive growth of science and this sparking of a new revolution known as the scientific revolution. So the printing press is really important, and it genuinely transforms European society in many ways. It creates, it's very much responsible for the Protestant Reformation and very much responsible for the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment that we'll study later. So the printing press, don't sell it short. It is an important invention. Women in the Renaissance kind of experienced multiple things. Women from, as I've said before, from wealthy families generally experienced or were granted opportunities for an education, but their roles were generally confined to the domestic spheres. They weren't allowed to work in big jobs. They were basically just staying home. But with that said, like, women in the upper class had these massive households that had tons of servants and slaves and lots of children. So running this household was a complex affair. So you had to be an intelligent person, and it does kind of earn the respect of many people because these women are able to pull this off so well and so easily. But despite that, the role of the kind of the status of the upper class woman declines. There's more partitioning and a greater divide of gender roles during the Renaissance than had existed at any point before. Now, women in rural areas see less of a change than women in urban areas because the Renaissance, although we talk about it as being impactful, and it is in urban centers, really doesn't trickle out to the rural areas a whole lot. Their life doesn't change too much. They're not seeing all this great art, all these, I mean, they're just trying to farm and survive. The clock is kind of, it's not necessarily invented at this time, but it becomes more popularized, and this really kind of changes the concept of the day as we know it. They're better able to tell a 24-hour day. They're better able to divide the day into work and sleep. They're better able to divide the dark time. And this is so important during the winter when it gets dark earlier, is to still have a frame of reference for what time it is. Because before, when you are operating off a sundial to tell what time it is, the sundial doesn't work when it's night, and it doesn't really work when it's cloudy. So the clocks are game changers, because on days when it's dark, and that happens often in Europe, or during the winter when it's dark for a long period of time, you're still able to tell time, and it creates this real division between night and day, and it really is an important invention. It changes the concept of the day. It's no longer just how long is the sun up for, but it really is these set hours. And so you see these massive clock towers built in these cities as a way, kind of a frame of reference for everyone to see and know what time it is and understand what part of the day is going on. In Renaissance society, there is very much this concept of the other, and that is a non-Western European Christian. And there's a great fear and dislike of this other. There is general hatred toward the Jews, and that shouldn't surprise anybody because that exists throughout all of European history, kind of even to today, which is really sad, but it does. And it's building off of the Black Death and continuing to this time. They are kicked out, expelled from various nations, specifically Spain. France goes through times where they kick them out, and so these Jews tend to go east and settle in what is now modern-day Poland and Russia, who tended to be more welcoming of them because they would bring with them trade connections and money, but also they were less centralized regimes, so they didn't care as much about purity of religion. There's also great hatred and distrust towards Muslims, specifically the Ottoman Empire. And then also in Spain, the Muslims had conquered a great deal of Spain during like the 800s and had held on to it. And so Spain embarked on what was known as the Reconquista, which was to reconquer Spain. And so they do that. There were a handful of Africans in Europe that would come up either as envoys or sometimes as slaves. They were kind of seen as unique entities and kind of not necessarily better or worse, but just as different, sometimes seen as worse. But the concept of black as bad is not really existing at this time necessarily. Slavic people were also kept as slaves. That's where we get the English term slaves from. So Slavic people are from Eastern Europe, Russia, Poland, Romania, Ukraine. That region are the Slavic people. But it's important to know that slavery was not hereditary. It was not passed down from father to son at this time. It would end when you died. Your slavery would end. It would not go on to your children. So that is an important distinction between slavery in Europe and slavery as we know it in the United States. So that's kind of a brief look at the Renaissance, what society was like, and what people were doing in terms of painting and music and such at this time.